So what is the Christ myth theory? Did you heard some of our introductory comments? You'd like to add anything to that, Chris?
Basically, it's simply the idea that there was not even a historical man named Jesus who was executed by Pontius Pilate and who was basically centered in Galilee and was soon worshipped as a deity after he died.
Does Carrier have a unique version of that?
Yes, he does. And he's very careful and intentional to separate his version from many of the other versions of the Christ myth theory.
I've got a clip on that. I'm going to play a clip based on what you just said, Chris, from Carrier.
Forget all the other mythicist theories. You'll run into a lot of sort of more conspiracy-based, strange theories about Jesus myth concept. I don't think those have any plausibility. This is the only theory that actually has a defensible plausibility, and you'll see why as I go through.
And now I'm going to play a summarized version of his own theory.
Now, what I'm advocating is this secular non-historicity view, which is that Jesus was the name of a celestial being, subordinate to God, with whom some people hallucinated conversations or pretended to hallucinate conversations. And the gospel began as a mythic allegory about that celestial Jesus set on earth, as most myths then were.
I know he's serious and the guy is super smart, but every time I play that clip when I was editing this, I can't help but smile. The two together, especially because it's like, forget about those other guys, those are all crazy. And then, his version, this is the sober one. But I know, Chris, you're more respectful, so you don't have to make those kind of jokes. But I mean, is that a good summary of some of the attitude as far as starting off with Carrier?
Yeah, I mean, I applaud him actually because he can objectively look at the different versions of the mythicist view, and he will honestly say, yes, I think these are quite silly, and I tell my fellow atheists not to buy into them. And I think he is probably the only mythicist who strives to engage with New Testament scholarship.
That is true, probably, except I would say I think I see Robert Price to a certain extent do that as well. In fact, he was even in the Historical Views on Jesus book, and he interacted with John Dominic Crossan, Darrell Bach. I think James D.G. Dunn was in that, and Luke Timothy Johnson, I believe, were the other four scholars. Have you read that?
That's right. Yeah, Robert Price, he's actually more respected than Richard Carrier is among academics in New Testament studies.
Right, and he's really fun to listen to. I am envious of Robert Price's gift of gab. He kind of just rumbles, but man, if you listen to what he's saying, he's like really a wordsmith.
It's true.
So I'd like to hear it in your words, Chris. Carrier's distinct view, how would you have described it? We heard it in his own words. How do you see it?
From what I understand, he believes that at the very beginning of Christianity, there was a celestial god, or maybe an archangel, named Jesus, who supposedly appeared to people and gave them new revelations or messages from God. And then these people would be Paul, as well as the people before the Apostle Paul and after him. And over time, these sayings of the spiritual Jesus became transformed into sayings that we find in, say, the Gospel of Mark. And the Gospel of Mark is actually just an allegory, Carrier says. So even though it looks like it's a historical account, we're meant to see it simply as a symbolic narrative of deeper truths that this spiritual being named Jesus preached to the early Christians in hallucinations, basically.
Can I play a clip in relationship to that? Here's
Sure.
what Carrier says about how
The theory is this, that Jesus actually began in imagination as a celestial being, basically the equivalent of an archangel, who was revealing truths to his followers through revelations and hidden messages in Scripture.
I got one other clip along those lines real quick here.
And the point being is that Christianity began when they discovered that this had happened, or they realized that this has happened, discovered it in hidden messages in Scriptures, or had their hallucinations telling them this, that in the result of this, he had atoned for all of humanity's sins, and that meant that the end of the world could begin. And
Comments on that, Pastor Bob, Ramon, or Chris?
So the hidden messages in Scripture is the Old Testament, obviously, right? In other words, did the writers of the New Testament know that it was a myth, or did they believe that it was historically true?
You mean the New Testament writers?
Yes.
Okay. I think he would say that these characteristics of the spiritual Jesus that lived in the realm between, say, the earth and the moon, those attributes were discovered partly from revelations that the spiritual Jesus gave them, but also after a lot of time reflecting on the Old Testament and said, oh, wait a minute, in Isaiah 53, it talks about a suffering servant. So, hey, why don't we just understand this to be talking about our spiritual Jesus?
I've got a clip. I've got a clip on that as well, Chris. Maybe comment on this.
The reason is they saw this promised in the scriptures. You look at Daniel 9, Jeremiah 23 and 25, Isaiah 53, and Zechariah 3 and 6. These were seminal passages for Christians.
So that's where he's talking about some of what you're saying.
Exactly. The Old Testament is used kind of as a pool of information to draw from to kind of make a collage of the spiritual Jesus, to kind of put flesh on him, so to speak.
Now, in a number of different points, he talks about basically that being used for hallucinations. Is that correct, if I'm understanding that right?
Hidden messages in the Old Testament are one way they pull these out. So they're doing improper exegesis on Old Testament text and applying them to a guy who had previously just been a spaceman, and then they make him fleshly by applying these Old Testament predictive prophecies upon him. And then the other thing they have are revelation, what they call revelation, which are actually their hallucinations.
So yeah, that's a question I have. I mean, from what I understand, like people, do mass hallucinations happen in that particular way? I mean, that seems he mentions a number of different points. I'm just curious about that aspect of it. Does he explain a little bit further why he thinks there are sort of these consistent mass hallucinations?
I've heard him say one thing, that you'll have a couple key guys hallucinating, and then they contaminate the memories of others. That's one thing I've heard him say. And I've heard him even say one time that, well, some of that's more likely than a guy rising from the dead anyway. So take your pick. I've heard him sort of make that more as an offhand comment. There's a few other things I've heard him say. Chris, what would you say in relationship to that? The Christians always hallucinating there in the beginning.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what he said. But that's an assumption, of course, that it's a hallucination as opposed to a genuine vision. And he also draws parallels between these Christians' experiences and visionary encounters in other cultures today. And he talks about something called cargo cults.
Yeah, I think that's the atheist's favorite religion, is cargo cults. You can't listen to a Daniel Dennett lecture without some reference to cargo cults. But you're going to explain what that is and how they utilize it.
Yeah, well, I won't go into all the details about them, but the main point is that in other religions, people have visionary experiences. And Paul would have been in an ancient world context. So people would say the god Asclepius, a Greek god of healing, would appear to people in temples. And then people would wake up after dreaming about the god healed. And so Carey would say it's probably something along those lines. But the problem is, it's basically an argument from analogy. But you can turn the argument from analogy on its head. Namely, in this case, today, in many parts of our world, we have received reports of Muslims having visions of Jesus and dreams of Jesus, some of whom actually experience healing. And so if we say, well, in the New Testament, we have reports in, say, Acts and Paul's letters of visionary experiences of Jesus, since we see this in the New Testament, obviously, no one's seeing visions of Jesus today among the Muslim world, because look at these parallels. And that's the problem. In many cases, the people who see Jesus, supposedly, they don't really have access to the New Testament or the Old Testament. They have the Quran. So it really strains credibility in some cases.
Well, also, I mean, if you actually look at the New Testament, Luke, for example, talks about speaking to eyewitnesses. John, the Gospel of John, towards the end, the person writing it claims to have seen these things firsthand. You also see a similar thing in John's epistles, Peter's epistles. Now, I know some of the response that would come from Carey in relationship to those, but I just want people to see that his portrayal of early Christianity is not the way that they were viewing what they were doing at all. He's painting a totally different picture. When you actually read what the Christians are saying is happening, it's not historical allegory. It's not hallucination. It's not just private speculation or revelation.
So in one of the clips, Carrier said, all the other theories don't hold up. Only this one does. I'll show you why. What would he go on to say as to why all the other theories of the lack of existence of Jesus, why do they not have any merit?
Well, for example, I know one, the Christ myth theories a lot of times say everything's from a parallel, from a dying and rising God. And they'll mention Mithras, and he's keen on saying Mithras was not a dying and rising God. But then he'll kind of qualify and say, but there are some parallels. And then mythicists make a big deal about December 25th a lot of times. And he'll say, look, that wasn't part of the original Christian story anyway, so that doesn't matter. There's some things like that he'll say. Chris, do you got some other examples of how he's critical of other CM theories, as it were?
Yes, and he's also critical of ideas about Josephus being a source of inspiration for the gospel writers. He thinks it's very unlikely to think that.
Oh, okay.
And I think that the pagan parallels, that's probably one of the most common mythicist arguments you'll see on the internet. And ironically, even though Richard Carrier criticizes his fellow mythicists for drawing parallels between, say, mystery religions and Jesus, he actually engages in very similar argumentation.
Right.
And he talks about Romulus and a man called Zalmoxis. He says, now these are actually dying and rising gods, and we have good primary source evidence showing that they in fact died and rose from the dead and appeared to their followers.
Yeah, those are two of his more ones that he says are well-founded. You got a little chart here on page 615 of On the Historicity of Jesus, and it has a little chart, and on one side it has the Attis cult, on the right side it has the Jesus cult. And he's saying that a lot of Christian apologists say, hey, you guys have to understand the crucifixion was a shameful thing in the ancient world, and so you wouldn't start your religion saying, hey, our guy's been crucified. And he's saying, no, you could have a religion that was based upon this, and he uses as a counterexample, Attis. And so on the left side, it says Attis cult. Attis was preached castrated. On the right side, Jesus cult. Jesus was preached crucified. On the left side, Attis castrated was a stumbling block for many. And then he cites Augustine, City of God. And then on the right, Jesus crucified was a stumbling block for many. Cites 1 Corinthians 1. Therefore, Attis was an actual historical man castrated. And then on the right side, therefore, Jesus was an actual historical man castrated. He's trying to say, nah, it doesn't work. Well, a few things about this. One is, I want to know what is the evidence that we have Attis being preached castrated. First of all, there's a number of different accounts about how Attis died exactly. It's true, castration is up in there. But there's the festivals that took place in March, but the idea of Attis being preached castrated, almost trying to put it an equivalent to the early Christian mission that you see in Acts, I think is a little bit of borrowing Christian terminology to prove the point. The other thing is I looked up the reference from Augustine, City of God, and Augustine is there quoting Seneca, and Seneca is criticizing superstition of the Roman gods, and the book actually is now lost. So that means Carrier's relying on Augustine to relay Seneca to him, which is interesting that he would do that. But there, Augustine quotes Seneca, and Seneca he mocks a lot of these religions and then says, but the masses love them, the people do them, and it seems like good form and custom. Now I'm paraphrasing, but I encourage you to read Augustine's City of God 6:10 through 11. It's book 6, and then sections 10 and 11. And the other thing is interesting, he doesn't actually mention Attis. Now it does say gods that are castrated, but Seneca, being quoted by Augustine, doesn't actually even mention Attis in the first place. And so my point is that when he does some of these parallels like that, don't trust him and don't trust his use of sources. Now, I don't know if you've looked at that specific one, Chris, but do you have anything to add maybe about Attis or maybe the idea of the parallels and maybe even Richard's use of sources?
Absolutely. In fact, that's his use of sources is one of my main criticisms of his whole case. I'll just talk about Romulus and Zalmoxis since I mentioned them.
Right.
In Romulus, in his case, we don't have a unified source where it talks about him being a god that is killed and then that rises from the dead. We have a lot of sources about him that say that he just disappeared on some occasion and then later on he reappeared to some of his friends or followers, kind of in a shining form and saying that he has become a god. But there's no single source where it says that Romulus was killed, he rose from the dead, and then appeared to people.
Do you know the date on any of the sources we have extant for Romulus? If not, I know that's kind of hard to know, but do you have some general idea? Because a lot of times I notice these sources these guys use will post-date Christianity.
Well, Plutarch, he has a section, a work called Romulus, and Plutarch is late 1st century, but mostly in 2nd century CE, and that has a lot of parallels that Carrier likes to highlight. But again, even in that setting, it does not have this cumulative story about Romulus that Carrier is trying to present. Now, a man called Livy, and then Cicero and Ovid, and another guy called Dionysius of Halicarnassus, I think is how you say his name. They each writer preserves separate pieces of stories about Romulus.
Are there ever any dates given about when Romulus was said to exist on the Earth, if indeed anyone thought he did?
I don't remember the exact dates, but he would be sometime before the foundation of the Roman Empire.
Right. So that's the reason why I brought that up, is because that shows that you've got these guys would be writing this way after the supposed existence of Romulus, even though I wonder how questionable it is if people even really thought he existed or just sort of an origins legend. But even with that, you go back to the founding of Rome, that means these guys are talking about it, and it's way back there, and then they're talking about it here. That's a giant gap. But yet Carrier is going to say, well, I trust their representation of the parallels or the basic outline of the story is accurate enough about what they thought that then I'm going to say, so here's a parallel. I see a lot of double standard in the way this gets employed, because you have the Gospels much closer to the events purported, and he says it's untrustworthy because you have a giant blackout period between Jesus' life and the first biography.
Yeah. And then for Zalmoxis, just to summarize the problem there, he actually conflates two different traditions about Zalmoxis, but yet neither tradition describes him as dying and rising from the dead.
Well, what is Zalmoxis' deal?
Well, it depends on the source you read. For example, one source says the following. Let's see. I'm just giving a piece of it. And their belief in immortality is of this kind. They hold that they do not die, but that he who is killed goes to Zalmoxis, a divinity, whom some of them call Gebelezis. And at intervals of 4 years, they send one of themselves, whomever the lot may select, as a messenger to Zalmoxis, charging him with such requests as they have to make on each occasion. And so it's basically talking about human sacrifice, that they sacrifice members of their group to a god they call Zalmoxis.
Oh, okay.
First of all, let me commend Chris and VOCAB on their interest and knowledge on this topic. I know somebody has to do it. It seems pretty peculiar to me. I don't know what Ramon thinks, but this is pretty wild stuff. Here's my question for you, Chris. Is this going to be a growing theory, as we seek to get to the minds of young people, young atheists, VOCAB maybe for you as well? Is this going to be something that you're going to have to increasingly deal with, or will this go the way of
I'm going to say something offensive, but the greater the ignorance of history is among that crowd, the more likely they'll buy into this, because believing this theory takes a certain level of gullibility about the way historiography is done and what we find and don't find in history. Now, Chris, you could give a little more PC answer if you'd like.
Well, I agree completely. I think that the more people spend time on the internet watching YouTube videos and not reading actual monographs or books or journal articles, the more they're going to say, yeah, I think these are great arguments, and I don't think Jesus lived either.
Yeah.
And I think it will be a growing trend.
Well, yeah, I mean, it certainly fits in the kind of sensationalism of our day and age. I mean, that sells a lot of tickets. That brings a lot of eyeballs if you just title "Jesus did not exist."
Puts the butts in the seats.
And people like to silver bullet, right? And so I think even though as we're working through this, I mean, much of I think what's been put out there is fairly easily knocked down. That's what I'm realizing as we're working through this. Nevertheless, I think in every day and age, people will try to put this one out there.
Chris, let's have you join us next week if you can. This is right on the Sunday when we celebrate Jesus rose from the dead, so this is fitting. I'd like to discuss this next week as well. We'll get more clips from Carrie that we'll hear, as well as him discussing Paul and some other things. Can you join us next week on this, Chris Winchester?
Absolutely.
All right, let's do it.
We've been talking about a couple of books written by a well-known, what would you call him, an atheist? I guess he is an atheist, right?
Yeah, fair enough.
Richard Carrier's books, and we're continuing on. And let me ask Vermone if he would sort of transition into a new question.
Sure. I'd like to ask you a question, Chris, about a paper you wrote. Did Jesus even exist? The problematic argument from silence. And I'll sort of ask my question via the conclusion. At the end of the paper, you write that using a historian's understanding of and approaches to ancient history in general, one can effectively demonstrate a man named Jesus lived. And I guess that maybe I would love for you to sort of, obviously, I just went through the paper and hopefully take some time to read through it a little more carefully down the road here, because I think you did a good job of just showing how believing Jesus exists is, you can do that through historical method. And I'd love for you maybe to sum up why I think that's important to point out to people.
Absolutely. So basically, I believe in that paper, I try to take a comparative approach when evaluating evidence for Jesus by comparing the evidence for Jesus to the evidence we have for other Jewish people in his category. And these would be people who were Jewish prophets, wonder workers, and also Josephus, because I would classify him as a prophet, because in his works, Josephus says that I prophesied to Vespasian that he would be the next Roman ruler, basically. So historically, you would say, yeah, he's probably in a prophetic role in that case. And in that paper, I try to show that when you look at the evidence for these other Jewish figures in relation to the evidence for Jesus, we have an incredibly greater amount of evidence for Jesus than we do for these other fellows.
Can I play a clip where Carrier basically says there are no extra biblical sources for Jesus really that are credible, and interact with that based upon what you just said?
And all of the evidence that's claimed to exist outside the Bible either doesn't exist or can be shown to have Christian origins that are dependent on the gospel. But in these three cases, I don't even think the evidence originally existed. I think there's in the first case, it's just the guy never said it. In the other two cases, Christians actually meddled with the documents to try and change the text to put Jesus into the story. And I have this argued in peer-reviewed academic journals, so this is not fringe amateur stuff. So if you want like the serious hardcore stuff, these are the articles, and you don't have to go hunting them around because I put them in Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ. The actual articles that appeared in these academic journals, all three of them, plus a lot more. So you can just get that and you've got them all.
I got that book as well, Hitler, Homer,
Bible, what was the first one where the guy never said it? Who was he referring to?
I believe he's talking about Josephus with that one, perhaps. He might be. Do you know, I forgot the prior, I think it's Josephus, Suetonius, and Tacitus. I think those are the three he's talking about. Chris, do you want to comment on those historians or what he might be saying there?
Yeah, I'm not totally sure which one I think he means Josephus when he says one doesn't mention him, because he assumes that it's just a full-fledged interpolation in a section of Antiquities by Josephus.
And what were the two documents that Christians tampered with?
I think does he think that Tacitus was meddled with? I
honestly don't remember. I think he at least considers the argument.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if I'm understanding right what you've been saying here, I mean, you look at the ways in which we affirm that the Jewish war happened, Josephus existed, etc. All legitimate ways in which we say, yeah, those things actually happened. But when we look at all the different evidence for Jesus, it's almost like we have even more evidence for Jesus. But it seems like Carrier is almost denying that evidence, trying to chip away at all the different evidence that's there for Jesus.
Well, let me use Carrier's argumentation, if I may, and apply it to someone like Josephus himself. The only evidence we have for Josephus in the first century are the writings attributed to Josephus. That is it.
So so the point is no one outside of his own canon or corpus refers to him definitively, right, or at all. You're saying at all nobody refers to him that we have?
No one in the first century. It's not until the time of Porphyry, which is much later, that we have a reference to Josephus.
And that's a non-Christian critic of Christianity, correct?
Right. I should specify it's the first time we have a pagan source mentioning Josephus.
Okay.
And the other people I mentioned in my paper, like Hillel or Hanina Bendosa or Honi, all of those people are written about either by much later rabbinic Jewish sources. And that would be equivalent to, say, some late church father way in the future writing about Jesus. And since we don't accept what the Gospels say about Jesus because, well, they're Christian sources, we likewise shouldn't accept what these later rabbinic sources say about Hillel or Hanina or Honi because, well, they're Jewish rabbinic sources.
So applying Josephus's or Carrier's own methodology, at least the way he uses the criteria to are you out of existence, Jesus, we could do the same thing, probably to a much greater degree, with Josephus himself.
Precisely. And it's really, really bad because for Josephus, he is our primary source of information about first century Judea, the different groups of Jews there. I mean, thank goodness we had the Dead Sea Scrolls, but really, we rely on him quite a bit.
So, yeah. That's good. Well, can we talk a little bit then about what about in relationship to Paul? Here's something that he says about Paul, because people do need to know this, that even though the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, are there first, and it makes sense for them to start off the New Testament, chronologically, probably as far as history is concerned, Paul's letters were probably finalized, established, written, for the most part, it looks like first. So they would be actually the earliest sources we would have for Jesus. So if you look at Paul beginning writing letters around 45, it would have been 15 years after. And here's what he says a little bit about Paul in relationship to his epistles.
The epistles, first of all, which are our earliest evidence, only speak of a pre-existent celestial being and a revealed gospel. When you look at the epistles without the assumptions, you take off the Christian glasses and have no prior conceptions or assumptions about what you're looking at. If this was some alien religion and you were the first one to look at the epistles, all you would see in these epistles is a pre-existent celestial being, this archangel-type being, and a gospel that was revealed to people through revelations, through hallucinations.
One other thing, I want to play a quote, one other thing he says about Paul that I think is pertinent, and then Chris, if you...
Are we thinking, are we assuming Galatians is the first epistle?
Usually, or sometimes First Thessalonians.
Okay.
Here's something else he says about where Paul got his information from.
So for Paul, Scripture and Revelation are the only sources of information he ever mentions anyone having. The Jesus he knows and refers to and speaks to is always in outer space. Paul never places him anywhere else. And he never clearly places Jesus on earth or connects him to human history. So that's the clue that we have in the earliest evidence for Christianity.
Commentary, Chris.
Absolutely. Just a very plain reading of the text of Paul's letters indicates that he did believe Jesus was a human being at some point prior to the resurrection. I mean, we can just go through briefly some of them. In Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, he talks about Jesus being born or becoming literally out of a woman. It says that he became under Jewish law, which means he had a Jewish identity. In Romans 9:5, it says that he was descended from the patriarchs, literally according to the flesh. He had a Davidic descent, Romans chapter 1, verse 3. He had a Last Supper at night with some of his followers, 1 Corinthians 11, 23 to 25. He died on a cross in Philippians 2:8. He was buried, 1 Corinthians 15:4. He rose again, 1 Corinthians 15:4. And then he appeared after his death and resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15:5 to 8.
Sounds like Paul knows the story of the gospel.
Well, so help me here, Chris, or vocab. With just the Galatians 4:4 alone, born of a woman.
Let me play you a clip.
Okay.
Because I think I know what you're going to
And
say.
when he talks about being so-called born of the sperm of David or born of a woman, the word he uses is the word Paul uses for being manufactured. It's the exact same word he uses of Adam. When Adam is born, quote unquote, he's made. Adam wasn't born to an actual woman. In the context of where Paul talks about Jesus being made of a woman, he explicitly says he's talking about allegorical women, not literal women. So when you look at the context and you don't look at it with the lenses of prior Christian belief, you start to see what's actually being said here is completely in agreement with the alternative theory of the Christian origins, not the traditional theory.
Chris, have you heard that?
I have indeed, and it's not quite accurate.
No.
Yeah.
Are you saying that he might have made a lexical error?
Well, I wouldn't say it was an error as much as only partial report. The word that he uses in Galatians 4:4 comes from the Greek word ginomai, or ginomai, depending on your pronunciation. And that can have multiple meanings. It can mean made, become, or be born. And it turns out the whole phrase, born of a woman or becoming of a woman, is simply a Jewish idiom for saying, yeah, so-and-so is a human being. For example, in Job chapter 14, verse 1, we read, quote, man born of woman, few of days and full of trouble, unquote. And we have a Dead Sea Scroll called the Community Rule that says, quote, and what shall one born of woman be considered in your presence? And that citation is 1 QS 1121. And obviously, Job predates Paul. 1 QS predates Paul. I mean, it predates the whole Christian movement.
Let me explain real quick what he's saying there. He's saying that the examples he's giving about this Hebraic or Jewish way of explaining a person who's a human born of woman predate Paul's use of it, so it was already lexically established as a phraseology to refer to real human beings. I'm trying to relate what you're saying there. You're utilizing Job and you're using Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Is that correct?
Exactly right. And since Paul was a Jew, he says in Philippians he was a Pharisee. It is reasonable to think that Paul means he was a human being and he was born. And the allegory. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was gonna. When you're done, Ramon or Bob, I'd like you to comment. Go ahead, Chris.
And then he mentions an allegory in Galatians 4, and he's correct. There is an allegory, but that occurs much further down in Galatians 4 in verses 22 to 31.
Yeah, and he's changed topics there. He's talking about something different.
And he actually says in that section, I am writing allegorically.
Yeah, which is actually, so that's a counter argument to Carrier, because that shows you whenever Paul was going to do this kind of thing, it's almost like he's letting you know. It's like, you're on a blog and they're discussing the latest movie. Spoiler alert! If they're kind, they tell you that. It's like Paul is doing that in a way, except he's saying, allegory alert, I'm about to do this. And so that's kind of an indication, Paul doesn't always do that, does he?
So what is Carrier's understanding of Paul's insistence on the resurrection of Christ, 1 Corinthians 15? How does he handle that?
Can I play a clip for that?
Gus, you're prepared for this.
Yes, I am. Here's part of what he says.
Most important is 1 Corinthians 15, where he gives the Christian gospel in outline. But notably, in this gospel, nowhere does he mention Jesus appearing to anyone until after he dies. In other words, Jesus according to the scriptures, he died for our sins, and he was buried and so on. And then he appeared to people. He didn't appear to people before. There's no ministry in this. There's no earthly sojourn on this. And so when you look at this text without the preconceptions of later Christian faith, you start to see what's really happening here.
Spot the logical fallacy. He appeared to people after he died. Therefore, he did not appear to people before he died.
Circular reasoning going.
Maybe I'll be the one to ask this question. Honestly, hearing all this, I've heard debates with a lot of different atheists, and there's sort of an intellectual honesty, I think, that you look for there. I think there's places, we can sort of go at Christianity, and we have to have good reason for why we believe what we believe. But there's, in so much of this, it seems as if there's just sort of it's deliberately ignoring certain things, avoiding other issues, making taking something that really, this last one especially, that's just such a, to make a point of that, it just seems such a weak way to approach it. It just seems like it's taking advantage of people's lack of knowledge about historical method, and lack of awareness of sort of logical fallacies. It really feels that way.
The funny thing is, Carrier's prequel to this book on the historicity of Jesus is all about historical method, analyzing logical fallacies, using Bayes' theorem for your historical method, where you assign background information and prior probability to come up with basically formulas to determine the likelihood of an event. You actually give it numbers. He's actually saying, I'm educating people on historiography, and this is the only way to do it, to do right history. The funny thing is, so I agree, but he would say, I haven't done that. I've done the opposite. The Christians are the ones who've done what you just said. If you listen to him, I think you'd get something like that. I agree.
Okay.
But, what would you say, Chris, to that?
Well, I think one of the big pieces of historiography is use of sources. And unfortunately, it appears that in a number of cases, Dr. Carrier misinterprets sources. And I'm thinking in particular, literally every source that he says a deity dies, is buried, and rises from the dead in an area between, say, the earth and the moon, every one of those sources says nothing of the kind. He'll give you footnotes in on the historicity of Jesus when he's talking about an Egyptian god called Osiris. And so it looks credible. You say, oh yeah, he's giving you a source in the footnote. But if you take the time and make the effort to look it up, that passage, whatever passage it is, it simply doesn't say what Dr. Carrier says it says concerning Osiris being killed between the earth and the moon.
Same thing with Philo, same thing with Revelation of Moses, same thing with the ascension of Isaiah. I'm going to play a clip in relation to that. And can you talk a little bit about this idea after this clip about crucifixion just below the moon? Here's the clip.
On the most plausible mythicist theory, this incarnation, death, and burial took place in outer space just below the moon.
And here's what he says
what
here,
were the
too.
attributes of this Jesus who lives in outer space? He was the firstborn son of God. He was the celestial image of God.
But you know the background of those. Could you explain people what's going on there, Chris?
Yeah, essentially he's saying that all of these sources are teaching that there's a realm between the earth and the moon where bodies can exist and be killed and they return to life. And he appeals to people like, I've mentioned Plutarch before, but he also mentions Philo of Alexandria. And if you look in the sources themselves, the writers, you can kind of put them in a category called Neoplatonism. These are people,
especially Philo. I mean, anyone that has just done some basic study in this area, that's the word of the day. But yeah, well, go ahead.
And Philo and Plutarch, for them, to be in a body is to actually be on earth alive. To not be in the body is to be dead, or in some interim form between life and death. It would not make sense to someone like, say, Philo to say, and then George, he got his body between the earth and the moon. He would be very confused because for Philo, to have a body is to be physical on the earth. And the same is true of the other Neoplatonist. We do have evidence there was a realm between the earth and the moon, but that realm was populated by incorporeal spirits without bodies and souls.
You say evidence that they believe that.
Right. That the Neoplatonists saw that.
Can I play a little bit about him speaking about Philo and this pre-Christian Jewish Jesus figure that he mentions? Here it is.
There was an actual celestial being known as Jesus, named Jesus, in Jewish theology before Christianity came along. And Philo tells us about this.
Is that true, Chris?
No. In fact, Philo doesn't mention the name Jesus anywhere in the passage. And he's quoting from a work called On the Confusion of Tongues by Philo, and it's in section 62 of this text. And the relevant portion says, quote, I have also heard of one of the companions of Moses having uttered such a speech as this, Behold, a man whose name is Rising.
So the dude's name is Rising, and this is a companion of Moses.
Right. Well, he's saying that the saying, Behold, a man whose name is Rising, was attributed to a companion of Moses, which indicates Philo's not thinking, this is Zechariah saying this, because Zechariah was not a contemporary of Moses.
Well, hold on. You got to mention why. I've heard your other interview, but why is Zechariah important in this context?
Because in Zechariah 6, it talks about a man who's called Joshua, and in Greek, it's the equivalent name for Jesus, or Iesus. And what Dr. Carrier wants to do is say, okay, we have this piece of it in Philo, and so obviously he's actually using that piece of the quotation to point readers back to all of Zechariah 6, which talks about a man named Joshua being called Rise. But my criticism is that Philo does not, I guess you could say, capitalize on the name Jesus. In fact, he does not mention it. For his purposes, he's interested in the name of Rising.
How does Carrier justify saying the dude's called Jesus?
Because he thinks that the quotation in Philo's evoking the rest of the passage in Zechariah, which mentions a character named Jesus.
Okay, I want to make sure people heard that again, because I know you already basically just said that, but I wanted to see the connections he's attempting to make.
Do some of the other atheist Christ myth people, Carrier was pretty critical of them, it doesn't hold any water. Do they help you out on this, or are they silent in any criticisms of Carrier?
Chris, I'll let you answer too, but I would basically just say they're worse. Carrier is the best you've got. Robert Price is equal or something like that. But it's funny, in this book, 5 Historical Views of Jesus, James D.G. Dunn says this about Robert Price, quote, "In short, if Price's essay is a true expression of the state of health of the Jesus myth thesis, I can't see much life in it. His essay would be better retitled The Jesus Myth, a Thesis at Vanishing Point." Chris, do you want to answer, though?
I think that you hit the nail on the head. I think Carrier is definitely the best mythicist you can read.
Yeah, and that's not exactly easy to do, because between proving history and on the historicity of Jesus, you've got some pretty big brown books there.
True. Very true.
By the way, I want to give a shout out to my main man, Forrest. He is actually, my atheist friend at Unbelievers Radio, bought this book for me on the history of Jesus.
Oh, wow.
Which I really, really appreciate. It was a kind thing of him to do. And he said, well, if we're going to ask you to debate him, that's the least we could do. And another shout out to Andre Soleil, the other host of Unbelievers Radio. He bought Not the Impossible Faith for me. So I appreciate that, you guys, and the rest of the works I got on Kindle and Audible.
So you read through all that?
I have not read through all of the other ones. Like, for example, Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, some of the stuff in there is not relevant. Mm-hmm. So I haven't done all that. But the sections that are relevant, yes.
Man, well, kudos to you, VOCAB, for delving deep into this.
Well, Chris has done a lot of work, too. I mean, Chris, how did you get into this? I mean, why this? I know you're with Ratio Christi. I mean, why are you interested in this in the first place?
Well, it's just a very interesting topic. And I've thoroughly enjoyed studying the historical setting of the New Testament writings, and when I came across the mythicist movement, it was just very interesting to me. And so I thought, hey, I want to learn more about this and see if the arguments have any weight.
Are you doing your doctoral work in this area or something different?
Oh no, this is just a hobby for me. My doctoral work is actually on the use of Scripture in the Gospel of Matthew.
Oh, wow. That's pretty cool.
That sounds really good.
Chris Winchester, there's so much more to discuss. I probably have 15 more clips we could have played. But Bob and Ramon, thanks for humoring us. But I think you guys enjoyed the show.
This is better than listening about Star Wars.
Oh, okay,
wow.
It's similar, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess in certain ways it is, isn't it?
When this being revealed, quote unquote, that he had tricked the devil by becoming incarnate and being crucified by the devil in the region of the heavens ruled by the devil. So it was in a mythic world, a sort of supernatural place that this occurred. And we have precedents for this in the ancient world. There are other gods who did similar things, that they went and got themselves killed in supernatural places.
We'll play some clips from a lecture he gave to the San Jose atheists, and we'll be interacting with those.
And I should mention, this isn't, if you're wondering, so how common of a belief is this? Historians, this isn't a common belief among Christian or non-Christian historians. However, this is something that shows up a lot on college campuses. It's given more attention than you might realize.
So of the atheists, is this a 1% view or 10%? Anybody know how uncommon
it seems like there's some kind of, you could probably do an equation. The younger the atheist is, the more likely they're to believe in this. The more time they spend on the internet, the more likely they are to believe this. I'm being only half jesting.
Okay.
The older guys and ones who tend to read not just atheist literature generally don't abide by this. That'd be my reading of it. But let's have Chris Winchester, our guest today, who's calling us all the way from Scotland. I believe you're going for a PhD at the University of Edinburgh. Tell us a little bit about yourself and then introduce the Christ myth theory to our listeners. Chris Winchester, what up?
Thank you for that very nice introduction. I'm actually an American, one of the many American students who have migrated to the great city of Edinburgh to do doctoral studies in New Testament language and literature. And it's almost kind of a joke when I look around New College and I see all these American students. You have to look really hard to see a Scottish person in the school.
How do you recognize a Scottish person?
Mostly by their accent.
Yeah, they have to talk.
Exactly. I mean, in the movies, we typically think,
And then you can't understand them in some cases, right?
Oh, I was going to
That's-
make some kind of ethnically insensitive joke, but I'm not.
Well,
It depends.
you make enough bad.
I was gonna say
It's
something
okay
about-
it's okay to let it
They're
go.
the ones who are clenching pennies real tightly in their fist, but that'd be, I wouldn't say anything like that.
That wouldn't be
It'd
PC.
horrible, yeah. But what were you going to say?
well, it just depends on the person. If they're more from the highlands, it's more difficult to understand them. But if they're in the city where I'm at, it's a lot more simple to understand. Thank goodness.
So, do you hang out with Larry Hurtado?
I do. I see him just about every week.
Dude, you're hooked up, man. We did a show with him. It was probably my favorite show. It's all about Namina Sakura. What's the proper pronunciation on that, actually?
I believe it's either Nomina or Nomina Sakura.
Okay, so more of the O sound, not the Greek. Okay. All right, cool. Well, yo, man, it's good to have you.
Conquer sin by crushing the serpent. Fulfill Isaiah as the suffering servant. The Holy One who made it born in blood. Yeshua HaMashiach, begotten Son of God.